Good morning, everybody. Honored guests, guests of honor, I'm sorry the Minister has had to leave. I'm very happy to be here today with so many civil society friends and colleagues and friends from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Government of Finland as well. I have to come clean, Mina, that I had prepared backup speaking notes in case you didn't say anything that I could comment on. But you did, of course you did, and it's going to be difficult for me to confine myself to a few remarks on the many very important messages that you gave us here this morning. One thing that I'm also not going to do, Mina, is I'm not going to steal your UNDP thunder. I'm not going to comment on that. I think you said it all and I don't want to grab your headlines. Just from Civicus's point of view, a word about Mina Kai and his role as UN Special Rapporteur on the freedoms of peaceful assembly and of association. For Civicus, this is obviously our core business, and I would like to say from Civicus's point of view that we have been incredibly grateful to Mina for the amazing work that he has done to date under his mandate, the work that he's done by visiting countries on the front lines of the battle for civic space, the reports that he has produced and the advocacy that he's done at the United Nations in Geneva and places like this has been incredibly valuable support to Civicus and to our members, and I want to take this opportunity to publicly thank you for that. Thank you very much. The trends you've outlined are the trends that we've seen as well. At Civicus, last year we documented 96 countries that, as far as we're concerned, significantly violated civic space. We're just preparing to release our findings for 2015, and the number of countries on our list has grown to at least 101. So the sense is that this is a global phenomenon, it's a global crisis, and it's not confined as it might have been 5 or 10 years ago to particular hotspots, areas of conflict or areas that were traditionally difficult for civil society. Civic space is an issue now all over the world, in the global north, in the global south, in democratic countries, in authoritarian countries and hybrid regimes. You asked us to imagine a world without civil society, and I think that's a very powerful way. I think it's actually probably a world that is unimaginable, that would be completely different from the world we see today. In our own State of Civil Society report every year, a large part of what we try to do is reflect the many things that civil society is doing. And I think what comes through when you read those reports is that wherever there is a need, civil society will fill it, and I'm sure you and the organizations you represent in the room today are a reflection of that reality in practice, that you are providing essential services, that you have identified needs in your communities, and you are providing those services simply because nobody else is. And if that was not allowed to happen, and in a country like Azerbaijan, for example, where independent civil society has been completely obliterated, it's not just the democracy and human rights work that suffers, it's so much else as well, and it's to the detriment of society. A couple of additional examples that we have to this is the response to the Ebola crisis, where the WHO was slow to respond. It was civil society that was the first responder in that case, and more people would have died if that had not happened. In Syria, I mean, not just dealing with refugees, but on the ground in the country, it's the most incredibly courageous civil society organizations that are still providing frontline relief. They're pulling bodies out of rubble. They're providing medical support. And even when there was a lull during the ceasefire recently, people went on the streets and they protested peacefully, again, after 5 years of war, calling for the same things they were calling for in 2011. And so civil society still exists in Syria. It's still there, it's still resilient. Even in my own country of Ireland, I was reflecting as Mina was asking us to imagine a world without civil society. At the moment we have a homelessness crisis. in a country that had the highest economic growth in Europe for many years. And today, again, we are the strongest growing economy in the OECD, and yet we have a homelessness crisis. And who's responding? It's not the state, it's civil society. Providing shelter, providing food and soup to people living on the streets. And so I personally can't imagine that world, and I wouldn't want to. I think you've reminded us as well that civic space, it's often a term that we throw out there, and we need to remember that it's not the same for everybody. It's not experienced the same by all groups of civil society organizations. There are particular groups that we have identified that have much less space. And in as much as there has been progress on LGBTI rights for LGBTI people, in lots of countries, those groups are the ones that are particularly targeted, that cannot even register, cannot get a tax number, can't receive funding, must operate clandestinely or pretend to be a different kind of organization. In Latin America, particularly indigenous groups, community-based organizations are under severe pressure. And another subcategory of organizations that we've identified as being subject to even tighter civic space is anti-corruption activists, those that are trying to expose collusion between business and government and corruption at the highest levels. The point about the fact that the trend is now both a global south and a global north problem is also something that we have identified. The preliminary findings we have for 2015 is that in that list of 101 countries that I mentioned, 16 of them are on the European continent. Last year that was only 9, so it's jumped from 9 to 16 in 1 year that we consider significantly violating civic space, so almost 100% increase in 1 year. And countries like Hungary and Poland and the UK and Spain are all raising serious questions about what it is that makes a democracy. Yes, these governments are democratically elected. There has been, at least until recently, a free media in all of these countries. But the freedom of NGOs to lobby their government in the UK, the freedom of people to assemble and protest in Spain has been denied. And the rule of law, democratic institutions, and independent civil society in Poland and Hungary are under severe attack. And this raises fundamental questions, I think, as the Special Rapporteur really reminded us toward the end of his speech, that we cannot hide away from and that we cannot pretend are not happening. On the point of business versus civil society, this is an area that we consider is very important as well. Just to highlight one thing that wasn't mentioned, and this is the issue of civic cyberspace and what's happening to activists online. It's a particular area where business plays a very strong role. If you consider that last year the 16 biggest internet service providers and mobile telecommunications companies, out of the 16, 10 of them did not provide reports or proper reports on takedown requests from governments. So they're providing these spaces, these online spaces for civil society to enter, to interact, to do their campaigning, but they're being asked by governments to limit that space in a number of cases. And we don't know the full picture there. We don't know why they're doing that in what cases, and which governments in particular are asking them to take down content. And so I think businesses have both an opportunity there to come on side, to make sure that those spaces are safe spaces, that they're protected, and that they're transparent about what they're doing. You asked us, Special Rapporteur, why is the world so scared of peaceful civil society activists? And I wonder the same thing myself. I think the point for me was summed up in the middle of last year when in Angola 15 young people got together to read a book about nonviolent mobilization written by Gene Sharp, who is an American political scientist who has studied the history of nonviolent struggle all over the world, documented it, and written a book to help peaceful nonviolent activists copy some of the same tactics and strategies that they can use in their own struggles. And these 15 young people were meeting privately to discuss this, to see what they could do in Angola. And the state responded with brutality. It arrested them, tortured them, kept them in detention, and has charged them with a number of offenses against the state. And that case is still ongoing. And it sums up for me the distance between governments and their citizens and civil societies. I think that for 15 young people to want to read a book about peace, essentially, should be a good thing, should be encouraged. And I think we tend to forget that not only does civil society do all of the things we've mentioned, but it's often the only thing standing between societies and violence. That it has an enormous role to play when it comes to peace. And we might tend to think that there's a lot of violence in the world today, but if we try to imagine a world without civil society, I think it would be a whole lot worse. The Special Rapporteur reminded us that protests are here to stay. I think he's probably right. But he was also very modest because he didn't mention that just last week he and another Special Rapporteur released a very useful document, a set of guidelines for governments to use to regulate protests properly. And I want to really emphasize this because I think it's an incredibly valuable product and something that I would encourage all governments in all parts of the world to take, to domesticate, to develop action plans with civil society to try and implement the recommendations that are in that report, so that it is very clear to police forces in which cases disbursement of protests can happen, how that can happen, how protest notification should happen, that you should not have to rely on the approval of the authorities to carry out a demonstration, but you simply have to notify the authorities within a reasonable period of time. So I wanted to give you some free advertising for that, Mina. On the points of projectization of civil society work and the phrase that Danny Sriskandarajah, the CEO of Civicus, uses is log frame-itis. That as civil society we're all suffering from log frame-itis. We at Civicus have consistently called for less projectization of civil society funding, and particularly projects in the democracy and human rights sphere, increased core support and increased support directly to local civil society organizations. The OECD has consistently reported that the majority of funding for this kind of work doesn't go to local civil society. It might get there indirectly after a while, but local groups are still dependent on handouts from various parts of the chain. And we feel very strongly, we agree with the Special Rapporteur that needs to change if change is to happen on the ground. In terms of civil society's business as usual, I think that there is an important point to be made here, that we do need to do a lot more than just doing more, that we need to think outside of our comfort zone, and that we need to come up with new tools and new tactics and strategies, and maybe to, instead of holding that mirror up to ourselves and looking for organizations that look and feel and think like we do, to broaden that picture quite a bit, so that we do look at new organic social movements that may pop up and disappear a few months later, that we look at supporting frontline activists, that we look at understanding civil society through a local lens instead of through our own. At Civicus, we're trying to do this. We're beginning to do this by developing a couple of new tools, one of which is supported by the Finnish government, which is the data shift project that the minister mentioned. And this tries to empower citizens through the generation of citizen-generated data. So big data generated by citizens that can be independently produced and then used to verify development milestones. It can be used to lobby governments. It can be used to do a whole host of things from a much stronger and informed point of view. And we're also trying to develop a new way of tracking what's happening with civic space in the world, something that allows us to be more flexible, more responsive, and present a constantly updated picture that reflects the voices of civil society in every country. I think I'll conclude by just highlighting that for us, some of the most recent attacks point to, the only word that I can use is brazen. The attacks on civil society appear to be becoming more brazen. I remember I was in St. Petersburg at a United Nations conference against corruption only a few months ago, and there were four people outside the venue distributing leaflets on anti-corruption. They were just standing there handing out leaflets to the delegates of the conference. And they were arrested in front of the eyes of delegates of 160 UN countries. Turkey didn't just shut down a newspaper last week, it took it over. It put its own people in there, and now it has become a government newspaper, the main newspaper in the country. So I think that for us, there seems to be less holding governments back when they're doing this. And I wonder how much of that has to do with an erosion of moral authority in countries and in regions that had traditionally upheld the values of human rights and democracy. And I think that's a serious question we need to ask ourselves. I don't think that it's any coincidence that some of the most progressive human rights norms that were drafted in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. If you look at not just the famous ones of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but the UN Refugee Convention, which is today being violated all over the world, is one of the most progressive human rights treaties ever drafted. And if you look at the documents that underlie that and understand why states put the things in there that they did, it was because Europe and European countries had suffered so badly from a refugee crisis during the war. And they never ever wanted to see those kinds of things happening again. And so I think we need to revisit those and to think a lot more about the values of respect and tolerance and dignity and equality. Because civic space and the problems that we're seeing, it's not just a purely civil liberties and political rights issue. It's connected to what we are as a society, and I would encourage us all to have those deeper thoughts and deeper discussions as we go forward. Thank you very much, and thank you again to the UN Special Rapporteur for everything he has done, and to the Government of Finland. Thank you.